The court records say that in 1892, deep in the Missouri hills where secrets die hard and justice comes with blood on its hands, the Ozark sisters chained their stepbrother in the basement. 3 young women, 1 huge man, and a mother's screams that echoed through the floorboards every night while their father turned his back and walked away. But when the Magness sisters finally lost it, they didn't just lock him up. They found men in the woods who were wild and broken, and they knew exactly what kind of punishment he deserved for his crimes. What they did to him in that basement was more than just revenge. It was something much worse, something that made grown men in town cross themselves when they talked about it years later. The dad knew what was going on down there. Everyone in the holler heard the sounds, but no one stopped it or called for help. What makes sisters turn into monsters to stop a monster? And how far will people go when the law won't help them? The storm brought down the cypress tree, which had been standing for more than 200 years. Its huge trunk crashed through the wraparound porch of the Vance family home like an angry god's fist. Ara heard the wood breaking from 3 blocks away, where she had been picking up her grandmother's prescription at what passed for Portamonde's pharmacy. It was a small corner of Boudreaux's general store that smelled like mothballs and lost hope. The sound cut through the howling wind like a scream, and she knew without looking that something important had changed for good. She ran through streets that had become rivers, and her sneakers splashed through water that was up to her ankles and held decades of secrets in its murky current. The Spanish moss hung from the last trees like funeral shrouds, and the air tasted like salt and death. The Gulf was pushing inland, taking back what had always belonged to it. Portamonde was slowly going under, and it had been going under for years. Tonight felt like the last baptism. When she got there, the house was half crushed. An old cypress tree lay across it like a sleeping giant, its root ball ripped from the ground that had held it since before Louisiana became a state. It rose 20 feet into the stormy sky, a cathedral of mud and tangled wood. Ara looked at the damage and thought about how much it would cost to fix it, which they couldn't afford. She also thought that this might be the reason she needed to move her grandmother to a care facility in Baton Rouge. That thought made her stomach feel heavy with guilt. "Sweet Jesus, Mrs." Hebert from next door said as she came up to Ara with an umbrella that didn't help with the sideways rain. "That tree has been here since the time of my great-great-grandmother. Never seen it lean so much in a hurricane." Ara nodded without thinking, her archivist's mind already making a list of what would need to be saved from the wreckage. She had run away from this place for 27 years, but now she was back, stuck in a town that time forgot because of duty and blood. Her grandmother's dementia had gotten much worse in the last 6 months. The smart woman who raised her had become a confused stranger who sometimes looked at Ara like she was a burglar. As she walked around the fallen giant, looking at the damage, the storm started to calm down. The root ball had made a hole in the ground that was deep enough to bury a car, and all that was left behind were the things that had been there for hundreds of years: rusty tools, broken pottery, and pieces of glass that had been worn smooth by time. Some of the older residents had always said that this was holy ground, a place of peace between the living and the dead. Mrs. Hebert was the first to see it. Her scream cut through the dying wind like a knife, high and sharp and completely hopeless. Ara followed her pointing finger to a place where something pale shone among the dark roots. It was bones that caught the last gray light of the storm and held it like a promise. The cypress's old embrace wrapped around human bones like a lover's arms. The skeleton was small and fragile, and she thought it was a man, but most of the clothes were gone because of time and the earth. But there, still held in finger bones that had turned brown with age, was something that made Ara's blood run cold with recognition: a harmonica. It was silver and handmade, with a complicated pattern of musical notes carved into its surface. She had seen it before in old pictures of her grandmother and yellowed newspaper clippings she had found in the attic. "Don't touch anything," Mrs. Hebert whispered as she backed away, as if the bones might come to life and chase her. "This is bad business, Ara. Bad, bad business." But Ara was already getting closer, her historian's instincts taking over the fear that told her to run. For 10 years, she worked in climate-controlled museums, cataloging artifacts and treating the past like a puzzle to be solved instead of a living thing that could reach out and grab you by the throat. Based on the craftsmanship and the pattern of the musical notes, the harmonica was definitely made before the war, probably in the 1940 seconds. She had seen them before in a picture her grandmother kept hidden in her jewelry box. It was of a young black man with kind eyes and gifted hands standing next to this tree when it was at its best. The bluesman Silas Blackwood disappeared in 1948 without a trace. All that was left were stories and songs that the old-timers still hummed when they thought no one was listening. The man who could make a harmonica cry like a woman or laugh like a child, depending on how he was feeling. The man who was said to have run away with a girl from New Orleans, breaking hearts and promises at the same time. But he hadn't gone anywhere. He had always been here, buried in the arms of the tree that had watched over Portamonde since before any of them were born. He had probably been killed and hidden where no one would think to look. The realization hit her like a punch in the gut, taking her breath away and making her knees weak. "Call the sheriff," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Hebert was already shaking her head. "Child, Sheriff Miller isn't going to want to hear about this. Some things are better left buried." Ara was already taking out her phone and dialing with shaking hands. This was more than just a family problem or a broken house. This was real history, the kind that was written in blood and buried in lies. For the first time since coming back to Portamonde, she felt something other than giving up. She felt like she had a purpose. Someone had been looking for Silas Blackwood's bones for 75 years. They could wait a little longer for the law to catch up with them. Sheriff Miller showed up 40 minutes after the call. His patrol car moved through the flooded streets like a funeral barge. He was a man who was more comfortable than confrontational. His soft belly and gentle eyes made people trust him right away. Ara had known him since they were kids. He had been her grandfather's hunting partner and her grandmother's bridge opponent, so he was almost like family. This made his dismissal of the skeleton even more creepy. "Old bones, darling," he said, crouching next to the root ball with the practiced disinterest of a man who had seen too much and cared too little. Could be anyone. Maybe it was a homeless person from the Great Depression who died of natural causes and was buried in a place that no one remembered. Could be from the Civil War for all we know. But Ara knew better. She had taken pictures of the harmonica before he got there, showing the complicated musical notation carved into its surface. Those weren't just random decorations. They were lines from Silas Blackwood's famous song, Cypress Moon, which the old-timers said could make angels cry and devils dance. She had heard her grandmother hum it a lot, usually late at night when the pain medicine made her forget to keep her mouth shut. "I think it's Silas Blackwood," she said, keeping a close eye on Miller's face, the musician who went missing in 1948. Something flashed behind his eyes, as fast as summer lightning. It could have been fear or recognition. Silas Blackwood ran away with a Creole girl from the quarter. That story is well known. He left his poor wife and daughter with nothing, never looked back. But what if he didn't? Ara pushed. What if something happened to him right here on this land? Miller's laugh was forced and empty, like a church that wasn't full. "Sweetheart, you've been in the city too long and your imagination is running wild. This is not a crime novel. It's Portamonde." People don't just get killed and buried under trees, but they both knew that wasn't true. Portamonde might be dying slowly and losing its children to bigger cities with better job opportunities, but it could be just as violent as any other place. Maybe even more so because people could get desperate and cruel when they were alone. By the next morning, Miller had taken the bones away, saying he had the right to do so because they were unidentified remains of historical interest. There was no investigation, no forensic analysis, and they were just moved to the parish morgue, where they would stay in a drawer until everyone forgot about them. The harmonica went missing with them, lost in the same bureaucratic darkness that had taken Silas. Ara spent the next few days at the town hall, where she tried to forget her anger by reading old record books and using microfilm readers. Her training in archives helped her here because it taught her how to read between the lines of official documents and find the gaps and inconsistencies that told more than the words themselves. Those records told the story of how Portamonde was saved, A story of sudden wealth that kept the town from going bankrupt, like so many others did during the post-war agricultural crisis. The Vance family mill was the most important part of that recovery. It was built in 1949 on a prime piece of land along Bayou Teque, where the soil was rich and the water rights were clear. Thomas Vance, Ara's grandfather, was said to have bought the land from a group of investors, but the more she looked into it, the stranger the deal became. The first deed said that S. owned the land. Blackwood had a purchase agreement, dated just a few weeks after Silas went missing, but there was no record of the sale being completed, no money being sent, and no signatures other than her grandfather's bold scroll. It was theft, plain and simple. It might have been legal theft, hidden behind bureaucratic language and official stamps, but it was still theft. And it had made the Vance family rich while Silas Blackwood's body rotted under the cypress tree that used to shade his front porch. The news hit her like a punch to the gut, taking her breath away and making her hands shake as she held the copied papers. All of her ideas about her family, her grandfather's business sense, and his moral character were based on lies. The mill that paid for her schooling, the house she grew up in, and the comfortable life that let her follow her love of history. All of it bought with blood money. She drove home in a daze, her head spinning with accusations and what they meant. Her grandmother was having one of her clear days. She was sitting on the back porch, watching the sunset paint the bayou in shades of gold and crimson, even though the storm had left some damage. These moments of clarity were getting harder to find, like pearls in a sea of confusion. Ara said, "Mama," as she sat down next to her, "I found some old papers about Grandpa's mill and how he got the land." Her grandmother's eyes sharpened, and the fog lifted like morning mist. She looked at Ara's face with the intensity of a woman who had learned to read between the lines of her own fading memory. "You know," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ara showed her a picture she had found in the Historical Society's files. It was of her grandfather at the mill's grand opening. He looked proud and happy, surrounded by important people from the town and smiling families. He was the man she had looked up to, the father who had built their legacy from scratch. Her grandmother looked at the picture for a long time, tracing the outline of his face with her worn-out fingers. Her voice was heavy, with 70 years of guilt and silence, when she spoke again. She whispered. The music stopped. Ara thought for a second that she had gotten confused again, but her eyes stayed clear and focused. That night in 1948, when the storm came through, the music stopped, and we all acted like we didn't notice. But in the end, the devil got what he deserved, always does. That night, while her grandmother slept fitfully upstairs, Ara searched her grandfather's old study with the same care as a professional archivist. Since his death 15 years ago, the room had been locked up and kept like a shrine to his memory. But she found what she was looking for behind a loose board in his desk, a leather-bound ledger with her grandfather's careful handwriting on it. The entries were coded payments, mysterious references, and initials instead of names. And through it all, there were constant mentions of the Cypress Man, and debts that could never be paid back. The last entry was written on the 13th of October, 1948, 3 days after Silas Blackwood was last seen. It only had 4 words, all written in her grandfather's steady hand. The music has stopped. The ledger became Ara's obsession. Its coded pages were spread out on her grandmother's dining room table like pieces of a broken mirror. Every entry told a part of the story, but the whole thing was still out of reach. Thomas Vance had been very careful, even paranoid, about how he talked about people and places. He used initials for people and landmarks that were no longer there. But patterns began to show up as she carefully used her skills as an archival detective, the same skills that had made her famous in academic circles, to find out what her own family had done wrong. The payments were large and regular, coming from her grandfather's accounts to men with the initials MB, LT, and RH. These initials belonged to the founding families of Portamonde, the Boudreaux clan, who ran the general store, the Thibodeau family, who controlled the fishing boats, and the Heberts, who owned most of the residential property. They were all linked by a sense of guilt and a lack of communication. Their wealth came from the same bloody foundation as her family's mill. Ara started her investigation with the care of a surgeon. She talked to the elderly matriarchs of these families as if she were gathering information for the town's upcoming 150th anniversary celebration. She acted like a good granddaughter who came home to take care of the family and use her professional skills to help protect Portamonde's history. It was easy to lie, using academic language and just the right amount of real enthusiasm to make it sound real. Mrs. Marie Budrow, 83 and as sharp as a fishing knife, welcomed her into a room that smelled like camphor and old secrets. The woman's pale blue eyes were cold and looked at Ara like she was a specimen pinned to a board. You say, historical project? How nice. Though I can't think of any interesting stories an old woman like me could tell. But when Ara brought up Silas Blackwood and asked harmless questions about the music scene in Portamonde after the war, Mrs. Budrow's mood changed like the weather before a storm. Child, we don't talk about that name very often around here. Some people are better off being forgotten, especially those who give up their duties to chase after worldly pleasures. When Evangeline Thibodeau and Ruth Hebert repeated the same thing in their parlors, it sounded too rehearsed and too uniform. They used the same careful wording and subtle redirection away from specifics, as if they had all been reading from the same script for 75 years. When Ara pushed harder and asked about land ownership records and business partnerships from the 1,940 seconds, the temperature in each room seemed to drop a little bit. Some roots are better left in the mud, dear, Mrs. Hebert told her, her arthritic fingers worrying the crucifix around her neck, especially when digging them up might disturb the living along with the dead. The warning was given with a grandmotherly smile, but the threat was clear. Portamonde had stayed alive by keeping its secrets hidden. Anyone who was dumb enough to start digging would end up alone in the dark with a very long shovel. The sabotage started slowly, with small problems that could easily be blamed on the town's falling apart infrastructure. The library's microfilm reader broke down so badly that half of the newspaper archives couldn't be read. A burst pipe flooded the Historical Society's storage room, ruining decades' worth of photos and documents. When Ara asked the parish courthouse for records, they told her that they had been moved to a Baton Rouge facility that was being renovated and wouldn't be available for months. The car crash happened on a Tuesday night as she was driving home from another interview that didn't go well. This one was with the grandson of a man whose initials appeared a lot in her grandfather's ledger. The road that led from Portamonde to the highway had always been dangerous, narrow, and winding through parts of swamp where the cypress trees grew thick as prison bars. The pickup truck came up behind her when she was going around a very sharp turn. Its high beams made her mirrors glow with light. The impact came out of nowhere, a huge hit to her rear bumper that sent her sedan spinning off the road and down the muddy embankment toward the dark water. She barely missed the bayou, and her car crashed into a huge oak tree. Her airbags went off, and blood was running from a cut on her forehead. When she got out and looked back at the road, the pickup was gone, as if it had never existed in the first place. Sheriff Miller showed up with the tow truck. He looked very professional, but there was a hint of satisfaction in his eyes. That road is dangerous, especially at night when people might not be paying as much attention as they should. Good thing you weren't hurt worse. Benoit found her the next morning sitting on her back porch with a cup of coffee and a lot of doubts in her head. He came out of the swamp looking like something from local folklore, skinny and dark from years of sun and being alone. People in Portamonde mostly stayed away from him. They would cross the street when they saw him coming and talk about how strange he was and how strange his knowledge was. But his grandfather was Clarence Thibodeau, Silas Blackwood's best friend and the only person in town who had tried to find out what happened to the musician. He said, "I heard you were asking about Silas," and then he sat down on the porch steps like he belonged there. His voice had the musical rhythm of the bayou, and his words flowed like water over rocks. "You've been stirring up mud that's been settled for a long time," Ara said. She looked at his face to see if he was lying, like everyone else she had met. But there was only a deep, inherited sadness in Benoit's eyes, along with something that might have been hope. "I found his bones," she said simply, "under the cypress tree." "Yes, I do," They've been waiting for someone to find them for 75 years. My grandfather never stopped looking or asking questions until the day they found him dead in his fishing boat with his skull cracked open. They said it was another accident, another sad event in a town full of them. Over the next few hours, Benoit told the stories that his grandfather had told him. These oral histories told a very different story than what was written down. Silas Blackwood was more than just a musician. He was a brilliant engineer who taught himself how to do it and had big plans to change the economy of rural Louisiana. He thought of a cooperative that would let the area's sharecroppers own their own farms instead of working someone else's land for low pay. His land along the bayou had unique irrigation potential. The white landowners knew right away that it was a threat. A successful black-owned cooperative would hurt the whole system that kept them rich and the workers dependent. They said they would buy Silas out, but when he said no, they threatened him. But he had been stubborn, relying on his reputation and his strong belief that things could get better even in a place like Portamonde. During the 1948 Harvest Festival, when the town was full of music and celebration, they killed him. A man's screams could get lost in the noise. They hanged Silas from his own cypress tree, then buried him under its roots, where he would stay hidden until a storm finally revealed the truth. The fight with Sheriff Miller took place on a Thursday morning that was gray and lifeless, like the bayou itself was holding its breath. The night before, Ara had organized her proof by putting out photos of the ledger entries, copies of the fake land deeds, and Benoit's sworn statement about his grandfather's murder. She put everything together with the same care as a prosecutor building a case, with each document being a nail in the coffin of Portamonde's carefully planned lie. Miller came to her door with coffee and beignets from the general store. He acted like a worried family friend with the ease of a professional politician. He made himself at home in Ara's grandmother's kitchen, filling the space with a casual authority that made her skin crawl. When she showed him her proof, spreading the papers out on the table like tarot cards to show an ugly future, he reacted exactly how she thought he would, and not how she hoped he would. He looked at the papers with the detached interest of a man looking at someone else's grocery list and said, "This is great work, sweetheart. Very impressive. But it's also ancient history, and ancient history has a way of hurting people who don't deserve to be hurt." He took a manila folder out of his jacket pocket and put it on the table with the carefulness of a chess player making a big move. The letterhead of Thibodeau, Boudreaux, and Associates was on the legal document inside. This was the only law firm in 3 parishes that still did business in Portamonde. The paper was crisp and official, with notary seals and her grandmother's shaky handwriting on it. Miller said, "Sworn affidavit," in a voice that was as soft as a priest giving last rites. "Your grandma said this 6 months ago, when she was still having more good days than bad ones. It says right here that Silas Blackwood left town on his own in October 1948. She saw him packing his things and heard him talk about starting over somewhere else. She said she never saw any signs of foul play and never heard anyone talk about violence or coercion." Ara stared at the document, her grandmother's signature moving across the bottom like a woman drowning in her own failing mind. The words were clear, legal, and completely damning to any hope of justice. Miller had played his cards right, using her grandmother's illness as both a weapon and a shield. "Of course, if you were to pursue this matter," he said, still sounding friendly and conversational, "there would have to be questions about your fitness as a guardian. Your grandmother needs special care and professional supervision because of her condition. The state-run facility in Alexandria has a great memory care unit that is very safe and secure. It would be sad if she had to spend her last days with people she didn't know. But sometimes you have to make hard choices to keep everyone safe." The threat hung in the air between them like smoke, making everything it touched sick. Ara knew exactly what was going on. She wasn't just being warned. She was being checkmated. The system wasn't made to keep the innocent safe or punish the guilty. It was made to keep itself safe, and it would kill anyone who threatened its stability, even a confused old woman whose only crime was having a conscience. Ara sat in the kitchen for hours after Miller left, looking at the evidence that had lost its meaning as soon as he signed the affidavit. When it came down to the harsh math of power and vulnerability, none of her training, professional knowledge, or love of historical truth mattered. She could tell the truth about the plot and lose her grandmother, or she could keep quiet and let the dead stay buried. There was no third choice. No smart way to make both love and justice happy. The next morning she started packing. Each folded piece of clothing was a small surrender to the powers that had ruled Portamonde since before she was born. Her grandmother, who was in a wheelchair and had dementia, sometimes recognized Ara and other times looked at her like she was a helpful stranger. The woman who had raised her, taught her to love books, and taught her to question everything was slowly fading away, leaving behind only bits of memory and moments of terrifying clarity. It was one of those clear times when Ara was cleaning out the bedroom closet that her grandmother spoke with shocking clarity. "The tapes," she said, her voice like broken glass. "Don't forget the tapes." Ara found them in a cardboard box behind some old winter coats that hadn't been worn in years. They were a dozen reel-to-reel audio tapes with her grandmother's younger handwriting on them. Most of them were from the early 2000s, when the first signs of memory loss started to show up. It seems that her grandmother wanted to record her own stories before they were lost forever, so she made an archive of her life for future generations. The first few tapes were boring, full of childhood memories, recipes, and gossip about neighbors who had died a long time ago. But tape number 7, which was from the 15th of December, 2003, had something on it that made Ara's hand shake as she turned up the volume. Her grandmother's voice, 20 years younger but already full of the fear of forgetting, was as clear as a woman confessing on her deathbed. "I have to tell someone about Silas Blackwood before I forget. I have to say it out loud, even if no one else hears it. I was 19 years old at the time, and there. I saw what they did." The recording went on for almost an hour, and her grandmother's voice got stronger as the 70 years of silence finally started to fade. She went into great detail about the conspiracy, naming names and giving details that no official document would ever have. Not only did Thomas Vance take Silas's land, but he also took it. He planned the murder by convincing the other families that a successful black cooperative would ruin their way of life. They had planned it for the Harvest Festival, when the town was drunk and busy. They hung Silas from his own tree, and then buried him in a grave that would never be marked. But the most shocking thing happened near the end of the tape, when her grandmother's voice dropped to a whisper, full of regret for the past. She said, "Silas had a feeling about the danger. In the weeks leading up to his death, he made plans by recording his music and writing down his engineering plans on a series of master records. He had given them to Clarence Thibodeau to keep safe, trusting his best friend to keep his memory alive if something happened to him. Clarence never got to use them," her grandmother said. "They killed him too, and made it look like an accident. But that old man was smart. He put those records in a place where no one would look for them. Before he died, he told his grandson the secret. Benoit knows where they are. He's been waiting all these years for someone to ask the right questions." The tape ended with her grandmother crying, the sound of a woman who had been carrying a heavy load for too long. Ara sat in the bedroom, which was getting darker, and cried as she finally understood how bad the tragedy really was. It wasn't just about Silas Blackwood anymore. It was about her grandmother's desperate need for forgiveness and honoring the conscience that had been buried under years of fear and complicity. At dawn, Ara found Benoit pulling his pirogue through the foggy channels where the bayou was deepest and the secrets were buried in layers of silt and time. The recording of her grandmother's confession had played all night, and each time it did, it made Ara more aware of the truth, until she realized that she couldn't stay quiet any longer. Some debts could only be paid by revealing the truth. Some ghosts could only be put to rest by being recognized. She called his name across the water, and her voice cut through the Spanish moss like a prayer that had finally been spoken out loud. He listened to the tape in the small cabin of his fishing shack. His face was old and tired, but his grandmother's voice filled the space between them with 75 years of guilt that had been hidden away. He sat in silence for a long time after it was over, looking at his hands as if they held the answers to questions he had been afraid to ask. Finally, he got up and walked to a corner of the cabin where fishing nets hung like dreams that had been left behind. The holes in them showed that they had been mended for decades. There was a compartment behind the nets, built right into the wall, that Ara would never have found on her own. Benoit's hands moved with the care of a priest handling holy relics as he took off boards that had been carefully fitted to look like they were permanent. The master recordings that Silas Blackwood had given to his best friend just days before his murder were inside, wrapped in oilcloth and kept safe by the dry air of a space that had never flooded. There were 12 records in all, and Silas wrote the song titles and dates on each one in neat handwriting. But the most important thing was that there were blueprints rolled up in waterproof tubes. These were engineering drawings that showed irrigation systems decades ahead of their time, agricultural innovations that could have changed the whole Mississippi Delta. Silas Blackwood was more than just a musician. He was a visionary who knew that real freedom came from being financially independent and having long-term success. Era held one of the records up to the light coming through the cabin's only window and was amazed that something so fragile had survived when everything else had been destroyed. The wax surface shone like dark water, and the voice of a man who had been silenced but never really beaten was trapped in its grooves. This was his second chance to speak out across the years and demand the justice that had been denied him in life. Instead of fighting Portamonde's entrenched power structure in courts that would never listen and officials who would never care, Ara chose a different battlefield. She got in touch with Dr. Marcus Williams, a well-known musicologist at Tulane University who was known for his work on lost American folk traditions. Williams was so excited about what he called the most important musical archaeological discovery of the 21st century that he drove to Portamonde with recording equipment just a few hours after hearing Silas Blackwood's music. The story spread like wildfire through academic journals and music magazines before making its way to the mainstream media with the force of a truth that had finally come to light. The music of Silas Blackwood was haunting, sophisticated, and completely original. He was a genius who took ideas from blues, jazz, and classical music and made something completely new. But it was his engineering plans that really caught people's attention. Technical drawings that showed an understanding of sustainable farming that wouldn't become popular for another 50 years. Within weeks, major news networks were sending crews to Portamonde. This turned the dying town into an unwilling stage for national discussions about racial violence, economic exploitation, and the long shadow of historical injustice. At the Cypress Stump, where Silas's body was found, the Today Show filmed a segment. CNN talked to Benoit about how his family has been keeping the records safe for decades. The Washington Post published a 3-part investigative series that looked into the links between the 1948 conspiracy and the widespread suppression of black innovation in the South. Marie Boudreau, Evangeline Thibodeau, and Ruth Hebert, the 3 elderly matriarchs who had kept their secrets for so long, were shocked to find that their wealth and power in the community did not protect them from the judgment of history. Their carefully crafted stories fell apart when faced with the evidence. For 3/4 of a century, their family names were linked to a crime that had been hiding in plain sight. 3 days after the story went national, Sheriff Miller said he was retiring because he wanted to spend more time with his grandchildren. The official statement didn't say anything about the questions about his role in stopping the investigation, but everyone knew that his career in law enforcement was basically over. There would be no criminal cases. Too much time had passed, and too many witnesses had died, but the truth itself had become a verdict that no court could change. Portamonde had to go through a painful public reckoning that no community ever wants, but some really need. People who used to go to town meetings that were mostly attended by retirees suddenly started showing up in large numbers, demanding answers. A group of citizens was put together to look into other strange deaths and disappearances in the town's past. They were worried that Silas Blackwood might not have been the only victim of the conspiracy. Ara's victory came at a price that couldn't be measured in news coverage or public approval. The grandfather she had looked up to turned out to be a murderer. The money she had inherited from her family turned out to be blood money, and the home she had reluctantly gone back to protect was forever tainted by its connection to horrible crimes. She lost the peace of mind that comes from not knowing, the freedom to think that her family's success was due to hard work and good morals. But she got something more valuable than comfort, a sense of purpose that went beyond her own loss and loyalty to her family. 6 months after the story broke, the Silas Blackwood Foundation was set up with the money from the huge royalties from his new recordings. The foundation's goal was clear and ambitious: to help young artists and engineers from underrepresented groups by giving them grants and other resources so they could achieve the kind of success that Silas had never had. It was a cool October morning, exactly 1 year after the cypress tree fell. Ara stood next to a bronze plaque that marked the spot where Silas Blackwood had been buried. The ceremony was small, with mostly people from the area and a few journalists who had been following the story. Benoit talked about how his grandfather was friends with Silas. His voice carried over the crowd like music. The New Orleans gospel choir sang "Cypress Moon," Silas's most famous song. Their voices rose and fell like the tide that would eventually take Portamonde completely. The plaque said simply, "Silas Blackwood, 1922, 1948, musician, engineer, visionary." Some voices can be silenced, but truth, like the bayou, always finds a way to the surface. It wasn't a monument to victory. It was a reminder of the cost of justice and the power of memory. Ara touched the bronze surface with her fingertips, feeling the weight of the choices she had made and the prices she had paid. She finally understood that some victories could only be measured in decades, and that some healing could only happen when secrets were allowed to come out and truth was given its proper place.